I never thought I would live to see 63 years pass without once hearing someone sing to me, without once blowing out candles on a cake with my name written across it in frosting, without once feeling that strange warmth that comes when people gather just because you were born. For 6 decades I believed that celebrating the day of my birth would displease God, that it was a pagan tradition rooted in selfishness and worldliness, something faithful servants should avoid. I believed this so deeply that I never once questioned it, never once felt I was missing anything, never once imagined there could be another way to understand what it means to honor life and thank the Creator for it. My name is Robert, and this is the story of how I celebrated my first birthday at 63 years old, but more than that, it is the story of how I learned to live again after spending my entire existence inside a system that told me exactly how to think, what to believe, who to love, and what to feel about every single moment of my days. It is a story about losing everything I thought mattered and discovering that what I gained was worth every painful step of the journey. It is a story that spans decades of devotion, years of doubt, months of awakening, and that one single evening when everything changed. Martha and I met when we were 19 at a Kingdom Hall in a small town in Pennsylvania where everyone knew everyone and the congregation felt like the only family that mattered. She had grown up in the truth, as they called it, third generation. Her grandparents had been among the early believers who went door to door with phonographs playing recorded sermons back in the 1930s. My parents converted when I was 7 after a persistent sister named Helen kept returning to our door with her bright smile and her certainty that she had answers to all of life's big questions. I remember the day they got baptized at a circuit assembly, how proud they seemed standing in that inflatable pool in front of hundreds of people, how they threw away our Christmas decorations that very afternoon and told me we would not celebrate my birthday anymore because Jehovah wanted us to be different from the world. I cried that night but learned quickly that crying about such things was a sign of spiritual weakness, that I needed to be strong and put away childish desires. My 7th birthday had been just 2 months before their baptism. It was small, just my parents and my grandmother who was furious about their conversion, some cake from the grocery store, 7 candles I had been so excited to blow out. I remember my grandmother giving me a toy truck I had wanted for months and my mother looking uncomfortable even then, already starting to pull away from worldly celebrations even before the baptism made it official. That was the last birthday I had for 56 years, and I did not know it then, could not have imagined that the next time I would blow out candles I would be an old man with gray hair and grandchildren I barely knew. Martha was beautiful in the way that faithful young sisters were supposed to be, modest and quiet with her eyes always lowered respectfully during meetings. Her answers always drawn directly from the paragraph we had just read in the Watchtower magazine. She wore dresses that came below her knee and never tight, her hair always neat but never styled in a way that would draw attention, her makeup minimal because we were taught that outward adornment was less important than the inner person. I was drawn to her immediately, to her gentleness and her devotion and the way she seemed so certain about everything. In the Kingdom Hall certainty was valued above almost anything else. Doubt was dangerous. Questions were signs of weak faith or pride. We courted under the watchful eyes of chaperones because being alone together would have been inappropriate and might have led to immorality. We sat in restaurants with Martha's mother or my father nearby. We took walks in public parks where we could be seen. We talked about our hopes for the new system and our desire to serve Jehovah faithfully. I proposed after 6 months and we were married 2 months later because that was what you did if you wanted to remain morally clean, if you wanted to avoid the temptations that came with long engagements. The wedding was simple, held at the Kingdom Hall with only members of the congregation invited because we were taught to avoid unnecessary association with worldly people even if they were family. My grandmother did not come, had stopped speaking to my parents after their conversion, and I felt her absence like a wound but told myself she was the one missing out on the truth. We settled into the rhythm of life as Jehovah's Witnesses with the certainty that we were doing everything right, that we had found the narrow road that led to life while everyone else was on the broad road to destruction. We believed we were part of something special, that we alone understood the Bible correctly, that everyone outside our faith was walking in darkness, soon to be destroyed at Armageddon if they did not accept our message. This belief gave us purpose, but it also made us judgmental, made us see the world in stark categories of us and them, saved and condemned, truth and lies. There was no room for nuance, no space for gray areas. Everything was black and white and we knew which side we were on. Our days followed a pattern that never varied much over the years. I worked at a printing company, steady work that paid enough to keep us comfortable but never extravagant because we were taught that pursuing wealth was dangerous, that it could distract us from the ministry. The owner was not a witness and sometimes made comments about how dedicated I was, how I never worked overtime because I had meetings to attend, how I turned down promotions because they would require me to miss too much service time. He did not understand, and I did not try to explain because we were taught that worldly people could not comprehend spiritual priorities. Martha stayed home after our first child was born, David, and then 2 years later came Sarah, and 3 years after that came Michael. We raised them the way we had been taught, with family worship every Monday night where we would read Bible stories from the My Book of Bible Stories and practice our presentations for field service, with meetings 3 times a week where they sat quietly beside us learning to underline their Watchtower magazines and raise their hands to give the approved answers. They learned early that independent thinking was dangerous, that questioning the organization was the same as questioning God, that obedience was the highest virtue. We never celebrated their birthdays, and they learned early not to ask why their schoolmates had parties with balloons and presents while they came home to just another ordinary day. I remember David coming home from first grade confused because all the other kids had celebrated their birthdays, and he wanted to know when his was and why we did not do anything special. Martha and I sat him down and explained, using the same reasoning we had been given, that birthday celebrations had pagan origins, that they honored the individual rather than God, that the only 2 birthdays mentioned in the Bible ended with someone dying. We told him this with confidence as if we had researched it ourselves, but really we were just repeating what we had been taught, what was printed in our publications, what the elders reinforced from the platform. We never thought to question whether this teaching made sense or whether denying children the simple joy might harm them in ways we could not see. David seemed to accept this explanation the way children accept most things their parents tell them, but I caught him sometimes looking at other kids' birthday invitations with something like longing in his eyes. We told him he should feel sorry for those children, that they were being taught to be selfish and to value material things, that Jehovah would soon destroy this system and then no one would celebrate birthdays anymore. We believed we were protecting him, teaching him to be strong and different, helping him store up treasures in heaven rather than on earth. We did not see that we were teaching him to suppress his natural desires, to feel guilty for wanting what every other child wanted, to build walls between himself and his peers. Christmas was the same, and Halloween, and every other holiday that our neighbors celebrated with lights and music and gathering together. I remember one December when David was about 9, we drove past a house that had elaborate Christmas decorations, lights everywhere, a nativity scene on the lawn, music playing from outdoor speakers. David pressed his face to the window and said it looked so pretty, and I snapped at him that Satan uses pretty things to deceive people, that those lights represented false religion and commercialism, that we should be grateful Jehovah had shown us the truth. David pulled back from the window and was quiet the rest of the drive home, and Martha squeezed my hand as if to say I had handled it well, as if crushing a child's natural wonder was good parenting. We told them they should feel proud to be different, that suffering for righteousness was a badge of honor, that Jehovah would reward their faithfulness. But I remember the look in David's eyes when he was 8 and came home crying because the other kids had made fun of him for not standing during the Pledge of Allegiance, how I had hugged him and told him he had made Jehovah happy, but inside I felt something twist in my chest that I did not have words for then. I felt it again when Sarah came home from school crying because she had been excluded from a birthday party and all her classmates were talking about it the next day. I felt it when Michael sat alone at lunch because the other kids thought he was weird for not celebrating anything. But I pushed those feelings down, told myself I was feeling weak, that Satan was trying to make me doubt the truth. I went to the elders for encouragement, and they praised us for raising our children in the truth despite opposition. They reminded us that we were training them to survive in the new system, that these small sufferings now would be nothing compared to the eternal life that awaited us. So we continued, year after year, decade after decade, following the same patterns, attending the same meetings, repeating the same messages, never once stopping to ask if we were doing the right thing. The years passed in this rhythm of meetings and field service and assemblies. We went out in field service every Saturday morning, walking through neighborhoods with our book bags full of magazines and Bible study aids, knocking on doors and offering people the same message we had heard 1,000 times. Most people were polite but uninterested. Many had no trespassing signs specifically mentioning Jehovah's Witnesses. Some were hostile and slammed doors in our faces or told us to never come back. A few would actually sit and listen, and occasionally someone would accept a Bible study which would fill us with the satisfaction that we were saving lives, that we had helped someone find the truth before Armageddon came. I remember one Saturday morning when I was in my early 40s, we were working a territory in a neighborhood I had covered dozens of times over the years. An elderly woman answered the door, and before I could give my presentation she said she remembered me, that I had come to her door for 20 years, and she wanted to know how I could keep doing this when no one wanted to listen. The question caught me off guard, and I gave her the rehearsed answer about how we were obeying Jesus' command to preach, about how we were motivated by love, about how we knew that even if most people rejected the message some would listen. She looked at me with something like pity and said, "You have wasted your entire adult life trying to convert people who do not want to be converted," and then she closed the door gently but firmly. I stood on her porch for a moment feeling something I could not name, something that felt like doubt but that I immediately suppressed. I told my service partner that she was deceived by Satan, that we were planting seeds that might grow later, that our work was never wasted. But her words stayed with me, surfacing at odd moments over the years, making me wonder what I had given up for this work, what I might have done with all those Saturday mornings if I had been free to use them differently. We attended conventions every summer, 3-day events where we would sit in stadiums with thousands of other witnesses listening to talks that reinforced our beliefs and warned us about the dangers of independent thinking, of questioning the organization, of associating with worldly people or even with those who had left the faith. These conventions followed the same pattern year after year, with the same types of talks and the same demonstrations and the same music and the same feeling that we were part of something special. We would come home exhausted but encouraged, ready to redouble our efforts in the ministry, convinced that the end was right around the corner. The organization kept predicting that Armageddon was imminent, that the generation that saw 1914 would not pass away before the end came. When I was young, this meant that we had maybe 30 or 40 years at most, that I would probably not grow old in the system, that I should not worry too much about retirement or long-term planning because the new system would come before any of that mattered. But the years kept passing and the generation kept getting older, and eventually they were dying and Armageddon had not come. The organization adjusted the teaching, redefined what generation meant, said the light was getting brighter and our understanding was being refined. We accepted these changes without question because we were trained to trust the faithful and discreet slave, to believe that they had a direct line to God that we did not have, to see questioning as a sign of pride and apostasy. I watched friends grow old waiting for an Armageddon that never came, watched them sacrifice education and careers and relationships because they believed the end was so close there was no point in planning for a future in the system. I watched young people get married too early because they could not wait to have sex and could not have sex without marriage and did not want to waste time with long engagements when the new system was coming any day. I watched families torn apart by shunning policies that cut off anyone who left or was disfellowshipped, watched parents lose contact with their children and siblings lose contact with each other, all in the name of maintaining organizational purity. We believed we had a unity no other religion could match, that we alone understood the Bible correctly, that our organization was directed by God Himself. When doubts crept in, I pushed them away immediately, trained as I was to recognize such thoughts as attacks from Satan trying to weaken my faith. When I noticed inconsistencies or teachings that seemed to change, I told myself that the light was getting brighter, that Jehovah was revealing truth gradually, that it was my job to remain loyal and obedient no matter what. I never spoke these doubts aloud, not even to Martha, because I knew that questioning the organization was equated with questioning God Himself, that expressing doubt could lead to being marked or even disfellowshipped if the elders thought you were spreading apostate ideas. But children have a way of seeing through things that adults have trained themselves not to see. As David grew into his teenage years, he started asking questions that were harder to answer with the standard responses. Why could we not have any friends outside the congregation when Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners? Why did the organization keep predicting dates for Armageddon that never came true? Why were we discouraged from going to college when education could help us support our families and serve God better? Why did we shun people when they left if we believed we had the truth? Should not the truth be able to stand up to scrutiny without needing to isolate people who questioned it? I remember the tension at our dinner table during those years, the way I would raise my voice and tell him he was showing a rebellious spirit, the way Martha would try to smooth things over while her eyes pleaded with him to just conform, to just accept, to just stop making waves. I remember one argument when David was 17 and had been accepted to a local college, but the elders were pressuring him to turn it down and pioneer instead. He asked me what I wanted for him, and I said I wanted him to put Jehovah first, and he said, "No, Dad, what do you want? If there was no organization, what would you want for me?" I could not answer him because I did not know, had never allowed myself to think about what I wanted separate from what the organization told me to want. David went to college despite our objections, despite the elders counseling against it, despite the whispered criticisms at the Kingdom Hall about how we had failed to train him properly. He got a degree in engineering and a good job and moved to a city 2 hours away and slowly drifted away from the organization. He stopped attending meetings, stopped going out in service, stopped calling except for brief conversations about practical matters. The elders asked us if we had tried to encourage him, and we said we had, but he would not listen, and they counseled us to limit our association with him, to not make him feel comfortable in his choice to leave the truth, to maintain a firm stand that might eventually motivate him to return. Sarah was quieter about her doubts, but I could see her pulling away too, spending more time in her room, coming home from meetings and going straight to bed without the family study we used to have. She started dating a young man in the congregation who seemed spiritually strong, who was a ministerial servant and pioneer and who everyone said would make a good husband. They got engaged when she was 20 and married 6 months later, and I thought maybe marriage would settle her, would help her find her place in the congregation. But 2 years later she confessed to the elders that she was having doubts about the organization, that she had been researching on the internet despite knowing we were told not to look at apostate websites, that she could no longer in good conscience present teaching she did not believe. She was disfellowshipped for apostasy, and her husband divorced her shortly after, and we were told we should not associate with her except for necessary family business. I remember the meeting where her disfellowshipping was announced, the way the elder simply stated her name and said she was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, the way people immediately avoided eye contact with her, the way she walked out of the Kingdom Hall alone while everyone watched in silence. I remember wanting to run after her, to tell her I loved her no matter what, to ask her what she had found that made her willing to lose everything. But I sat frozen in my seat, Martha crying quietly beside me, the weight of the congregation's expectations holding me down. After the meeting, people approached us with sympathy, told us how sorry they were for our loss as if Sarah had died, offered encouragement about staying strong and not allowing ourselves to be contaminated by her apostate thinking. We followed the shunning policy the way we were supposed to, avoiding contact except for a brief phone call once every few months to check if she was okay. Sarah moved to another state, started a new life away from everything she had known, and we told ourselves we were doing what Jehovah required even though it felt like dying a little bit every day. She sent us letters that we did not read, left voicemail messages that we deleted, reached out through mutual acquaintances who told us she missed us and wanted to talk. But we remained firm, convinced that this was love, that we were motivating her to return, that maintaining our loyalty to the organization was more important than our relationship with our daughter. Michael, the youngest, seemed to go through the motions, but there was something hollow in his participation, as if he was there in body but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He got baptized at 15 because that was what was expected, because his older siblings' defection had put pressure on him to prove our family was still spiritually strong. But I could see it was not real for him, that he was just doing what we wanted to avoid conflict. When he turned 18 he moved out and slowly faded away from the organization, not with dramatic announcements or acts of rebellion but with a quiet stepping back that left Martha and me confused and hurt and angry. By the time they reached adulthood, all three of them had drifted away from the organization and we had lost them in different ways. David we could still see occasionally, though the visits were strained and limited. Sarah we had cut off completely following the shunning policy. Michael we saw rarely, brief encounters where we danced around the real issues, where we asked about his job and his apartment but never about his spiritual life because we knew he was not attending meetings and we did not want to hear him explain why. We told ourselves we were being loyal to Jehovah, that we were putting him first, that our children would eventually see their mistakes and return. But privately, in moments I did not share with anyone, I felt like I had failed at the most important thing, that I had lost my children in exchange for the organization's approval. The elders counseled us that we had probably been too lenient, that we should have been stricter with discipline, that we should limit our association with our children now that they were no longer serving Jehovah. We were told that while we could have necessary family contact, we should not make them feel comfortable in their choice to leave the truth, that we should not participate in their worldly activities, that maintaining a firm stand might eventually motivate them to return. So we created distance where there had been closeness, we declined invitations to their homes, we kept our phone calls brief and focused on practical matters. I told myself this was love, that I was following Bible principles, that I was putting God first. But every time I hung up the phone after a strained conversation with one of my children, I felt sick inside, felt like I was betraying something fundamental about what it meant to be a parent. Years went by like this, years of maintaining the appearance of faithfulness while feeling increasingly empty inside. Martha and I attended every meeting, we commented regularly using the prepared answers from the study materials, we went out in service, we hosted the book study in our home. We did all the things faithful witnesses were supposed to do, but somewhere along the way it had stopped meaning anything. We were going through the motions, playing a role, performing for an audience of elders and congregation members who were also performing. But something had shifted, some foundation had cracked, and I could not stop thinking about my children and whether I had done the right thing in raising them the way I did. I started noticing things I had never let myself notice before, the way families were torn apart by shunning policies, the way people who asked sincere questions were labeled as apostates and cast out, the way elders wielded authority over people's lives with little accountability, the way the organization demanded absolute loyalty and punished any deviation with social death. I noticed how many people seemed depressed and anxious, how many were on medication for mental health issues, how many were struggling but could not speak honestly about it because that would be seen as spiritual weakness. I noticed how controlling it all was, how every aspect of our lives was regulated, how we were told what to wear and how to groom and who to associate with and what entertainment was appropriate and how to spend our time and our money. I was 61 when I started reading the Bible without the Watchtower publications to guide my understanding. It started innocently enough on a Tuesday morning when I woke up early and could not get back to sleep. I went downstairs and picked up my Bible, intending to do my daily reading, but instead of also pulling out the Watchtower library CD or the daily text booklet, I just opened to the book of John and started reading. It was strange how different it felt to read the text without the accompanying commentary, without the questions at the bottom of the page telling me what to think about what I had just read, without the cross-references directing me to supporting verses carefully selected to reinforce a particular interpretation. I came across John chapter 8 verse 32 where Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." I had read that verse hundreds of times before, had underlined it in multiple Bibles, had quoted it in talks and conversations. But that morning something made me stop and really think about those words. Set you free from what? I had been taught we were already free, that we had the truth, that everyone outside the organization was in bondage to false religion and Satan's system. But if we already had the truth, why did I feel so trapped? Why did I feel like I could not think my own thoughts or make my own decisions or have relationships with my own children? Why did everything feel so heavy and controlled and conditional? That question opened a door I had kept locked my entire life, a door I had been trained to keep locked because what was behind it was labeled as doubt and apostasy and spiritual danger. But once the door cracked open, I could not close it again. I started reading without the publications, without the pre-written answers, without the interpretative framework that told me what each verse meant. I read about Jesus associating with people the religious leaders condemned, eating with tax collectors and sinners and touching lepers and speaking with Samaritans. I read about him criticizing those who placed heavy burdens on people, who strained out gnats but swallowed camels, who honored God with their lips while their hearts were far from him. I read about him valuing mercy over sacrifice and compassion over rigid rule-keeping, about him healing on the Sabbath and defending his disciples when they were criticized for not following traditional practices. I read Paul's letters about freedom in Christ and not returning to a yoke of slavery, about there being no mediator between God and humans except Christ Jesus, about the dangers of following men rather than God. I read about how the early Christians had freedom and how various teachers tried to impose rules and regulations on them and how Paul fought against that, insisted they had been called to freedom. The more I read, the more I realized how much of what I believed came not from the Bible itself, but from an organization's interpretation of it, from 7 men in New York who claimed to be God's channel of communication, but who had been wrong about so many things over the years. I started thinking about all the teachings that had changed, about how we were told one thing was absolute truth and then years later told something different, about how we were expected to accept these changes without question and to forget we had ever believed differently. I thought about the generation's teaching and how it had been modified repeatedly as time kept passing and Armageddon kept not coming, about how we had been wrong about so many dates and predictions but still claimed to be the one true religion. I started researching the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, something I had been taught was dangerous and apostate but which I could no longer resist. I learned about Charles Taze Russell and his failed predictions, about the pyramidology and the bizarre calculations, about the 1925 debacle when thousands waited for Abraham and the prophets to return and nothing happened. I learned about the 1975 disappointment that I had lived through but barely remembered because we were all encouraged to forget it and move on. I learned about the United Nations scandal and the child abuse cases and the Australian Royal Commission testimonies and the policy changes that came not from new light but from legal pressure and bad publicity. I read accounts from former members who described experiences so similar to mine that I felt less alone even as I felt more devastated. I read about families torn apart by shunning, about people who had given their entire lives to the organization and then been discarded when they got old or sick or developed doubts, about the trauma of growing up in a high-control group that regulated every aspect of life. I read about the psychological manipulation techniques that cults use, about how they isolate members from outside information, about how they create an us versus them mentality, about how they punish questioning and reward obedience, about how they use fear and guilt to maintain control. Everything I had built my life on was revealed to be far less solid than I had believed, built on sand rather than rock, a house of cards that was collapsing now that I had pulled out one of the supporting cards. I felt like my entire worldview was disintegrating, like everything I thought I knew was being called into question, like 60 years of certainty was being replaced with doubt and confusion and anger and grief. I was angry at the organization for lying to me, for stealing my life and my children and my time, for making me complicit in hurting my own family. I was angry at myself for not questioning sooner, for being so blind and obedient, for sacrificing everything that mattered on the altar of organizational loyalty. But more than anger, I felt grief, a deep, bottomless grief for all the years I had lost, for the person I might have been if I had been free to develop my own thoughts and pursue my own interests and make my own choices. I grieved for my children's childhoods, for the pressure and fear and isolation we had inflicted on them in the name of God. I grieved for my relationship with Martha that had been shaped by organizational expectations rather than genuine intimacy. I grieved for the friendships I had never formed, the experiences I had never had, the questions I had never asked because I was too afraid of the answers. I could not keep this from Martha any longer. We had been married for 43 years, and I had rarely hidden anything from her, but I had kept these thoughts to myself for months now, afraid of what she would say, afraid she would report me to the elders, afraid she would choose the organization over me. But I could not carry it alone anymore, could not keep pretending at meetings, could not keep going through the motions when I no longer believed any of it. One night after a Thursday meeting where the speaker had warned against independent thinking and association with former members, where he had talked about how apostates were mentally diseased and we should avoid them like we would avoid someone with a contagious illness, I came home and told Martha I needed to talk. We sat at the kitchen table where we had eaten thousands of meals, where we had studied with our children, where we had prepared for meetings and discussed what we learned, where we had made decisions about our lives always filtered through what the organization taught. I told her about what I had been reading, about the questions I could no longer suppress, about the doubts that had grown too large to ignore. I told her about researching the organization's history and learning things that had never been mentioned in our publications, about reading accounts from former members and seeing my own experience reflected in theirs, about reading the Bible without the Watchtower lens and discovering a very different message than what we had been taught. I expected her to be angry, to accuse me of apostasy, to warn me I was being influenced by Satan, to threaten to tell the elders. Instead, she was quiet for a long time, so long I started to worry she was in shock that I had broken her with these revelations. Then she started crying, not the quiet tears she sometimes shed at meetings, but deep wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. I moved to her side of the table and held her, and she cried into my shoulder for what felt like forever. When she finally pulled back and looked at me, her face was swollen and red, but there was something different in her eyes, something like relief. She told me she had been having the same thoughts but was too afraid to speak them aloud, that she had felt guilty for doubting and had prayed for Jehovah to strengthen her faith, but the doubts kept growing. She told me about lying awake at night thinking about Sarah, about how wrong it felt to shun her own daughter, about how she could not reconcile that with the God of love we were supposed to be serving. She told me about noticing the same things I had noticed, the control and the fear and the way people were treated like children who could not be trusted to think for themselves. She told me she had started reading the Bible on her own too, and had been struck by how much of what Jesus taught seemed at odds with what the organization practiced. We talked through the night, really talked in a way we had not done in years, maybe ever. We talked about our children and how much we missed them, about the distance we had created because we were told it was what God wanted. We talked about all the experiences we had missed because we were told celebrations were wrong, about the birthdays and holidays and graduations and ordinary moments of joy we had denied ourselves and our family. We talked about the friendships we had avoided because people were not in the truth, about the education we had discouraged in ourselves and our children because the organization said the end was so close there was no point. We talked about 60 years of devotion to something we were now questioning and what it would mean if we walked away. The enormity of what we were considering hit us in waves. We were 61 and 62 years old. We had spent our entire adult lives as Jehovah's Witnesses. Everyone we knew was in the organization. Our identity was wrapped up in being faithful servants of Jehovah. We had no friends outside the congregation, no community outside the Kingdom Hall, no frame of reference for how to live any other way. We knew that if we left we would lose everyone, that we would be shunned and ostracized, that we would be labeled as apostates, and that no one would speak to us. We knew our names would be announced from the platform, and that people we had known for decades would treat us as if we were dead. We knew all this, and the fear of it was paralyzing. But we also knew we could not continue living a lie, could not keep pretending to believe something we no longer believed, could not keep going through the motions when we had seen behind the curtain. We talked about what mattered most and realized it was our children. It was having whatever years we had left to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by our devotion to the organization. We talked about integrity and whether it was more important to maintain our standing in the congregation or to live honestly even if that meant losing everything we had known. We talked about God and whether He would really want us to follow an organization that had been wrong so many times, whether He would really want us to shun our own children, whether the God we read about in Jesus' teachings would recognize Himself in the Watchtower's version of Him. We decided that night that we were done, that we could not continue, that we had to walk away even though we had no idea what came next. We did not make a dramatic announcement or write a letter of disassociation because we learned that would just give them an excuse to shun us immediately. Instead, we simply stopped attending meetings, stopped going out in service, stopped participating in the activities that had filled our days for so long. We knew this would eventually lead to the same result, but it gave us time to mentally prepare, time to start figuring out how to build a life outside the organization. The phone calls started almost immediately, elders wanting to meet with us, friends expressing concern, people we had known forever suddenly treating us with suspicion because we were missing meetings. We tried at first to explain our reasons, to share what we had learned, but we quickly realized this was seen as apostasy and would only make things worse. Any questioning of the organization was treated as spreading poison, any criticism was viewed as an attack inspired by Satan, any doubts were evidence of spiritual weakness or worse. So we simply said we needed to step back for personal reasons, and then we stopped answering the phone when we saw Kingdom Hall numbers on the caller ID. The elders came to our house several times, sitting in our living room where we had hosted book studies and get-togethers, where we had entertained traveling overseers and encouraged struggling publishers. They asked what was wrong, whether we were stumbled by something someone had said, whether we needed help with a personal problem. They offered to study with us, to help us regain our spiritual strength, to find us easier territories if we were overwhelmed by the ministry. They were kind at first, these men we had known for years, but beneath the kindness was an edge of worry because people leaving made everyone question whether they might leave too. When we would not give them a satisfactory explanation and would not commit to attending meetings again, when it became clear we were not just taking a break but were done, their tone changed. They warned us about the dangers of leaving Jehovah's organization, about how Satan was like a roaring lion seeking to devour anyone who strayed from the flock. They reminded us that there was nowhere else to go, that only Jehovah's Witnesses had the truth, that leaving meant eternal destruction at Armageddon. They told us to think about our children and whether we wanted them to see us throwing away everything we had taught them, whether we wanted to be responsible for stumbling them. I almost laughed at that last part, the irony of them telling us to think about our children when it was the organization's teachings that had destroyed our relationships with our children in the first place. But I did not laugh because I could see they genuinely believed what they were saying, that they were as trapped in the system as we had been, that they could not allow themselves to question because questioning meant losing everything just like we were losing everything. I felt sad for them more than angry, sad that they were still prisoners while we were walking toward freedom even though freedom looked like a wasteland from where we were standing. After several more attempts to reach us, after we made it clear we were not coming back, the announcement was made. We were not there to hear it, but we knew what it sounded like, had heard it hundreds of times over the years for other people. The elder would simply state our names and say we were no longer Jehovah's Witnesses, no explanation given, no details provided, just those words that would immediately change how everyone treated us. After that announcement, anyone who spoke to us or associated with us would be seen as spiritually weak or rebellious, would risk being marked or counseled themselves. The shunning was immediate and absolute. Phones stopped ringing, texts went unanswered, people we had known for 40 years crossed the street to avoid us. The silence that followed was devastating in ways I had not fully anticipated even though I knew it was coming. People we had known for 4 decades, friends we had shared meals with and served alongside and supported through difficult times, people who had told us they loved us and would always be there for us, acted as if we did not exist. We would see them at the grocery store and they would look right through us, would turn and walk away as if we were invisible, would literally flee down another aisle to avoid the possibility of having to acknowledge us. Martha's sister, who she had been close to her entire life, stopped all contact immediately, would not answer calls or texts or emails, treated her as if she had died. My brother, who had been baptized with me when we were teenagers, who I had grown up with in the organization, sent one brief text saying he could no longer associate with us and asking us not to contact him again. Neighbors who had been friendly because we were fellow witnesses suddenly became cold, would not wave or make eye contact. One family even put up a privacy fence the month after our disfellowshipping announcement to avoid seeing us in our yards. The isolation was complete and crushing, like being alive in a grave, like being erased from existence while still walking around. I knew intellectually this would happen. The organization's shunning policy was well known and I had participated in it myself countless times over the years. But experiencing it was like dying while still alive, like being cut off from everything familiar while still having to wake up every morning and figure out how to fill the hours. Every time I saw someone I knew and they looked away, every time the phone did not ring, every time I realized we had no one to call for help or company, I felt the full weight of what we had lost. We had given 60 years to this organization, had devoted our entire adult lives to it, had sacrificed our children and our time and our resources and our very selves to it. And now we were discarded as if we had never mattered, as if those 60 years counted for nothing, as if we were dead to everyone who had claimed to love us. But in the midst of that devastating loss, something unexpected happened that changed everything. Our children reached out. David called first, just a few days after the announcement had been made. His voice was careful and uncertain when Martha answered, as if he could not quite believe what he had heard, as if he was afraid it was not real. He asked if it was true that we had left, and when Martha said yes we had, when she started crying and telling him how sorry she was for everything, I heard something break in his voice too. He came to visit the next week, driving the 2 hours from the city where he lived with his wife and 2 children we barely knew. He walked into our house looking around as if seeing it for the first time, this place he had grown up but had not felt welcome in for so many years. We sat together in the living room where we had held family worship and studied for meetings and discussed Bible principles, and now we sat there as if we were meeting for the first time, 3 adults who shared blood and history but had been kept apart by religious doctrine. David told us about his life, about his wife Susan, who we had met only briefly at their courthouse wedding that we had not attended because it was not a Kingdom Hall ceremony, about his 2 children who were now 8 and 5 and who he had not brought today because he wanted to make sure we really meant it first, that this was not some temporary rebellion that would end with us running back to the organization and cutting him off again. He told us about the pain of growing up feeling he was never good enough, never spiritual enough, never devoted enough no matter how hard he tried. He told us about the confusion of being taught the world was evil but finding kindness and goodness outside the congregation, about being told higher education would destroy his faith but finding it opened his mind instead. He told us about the relief he felt when he finally walked away, how it was like being able to breathe for the first time, but also about the grief that came with it, the grief of losing his parents and his siblings and everyone he had known growing up, the grief of being treated like he was dead by his own family. He told us about the years of therapy trying to undo the damage, trying to learn that he was not inherently bad or selfish or doomed, trying to develop his own values and beliefs instead of the ones that had been imposed on him. He told us about the anger and then the acceptance and then the hope that maybe someday we would see what he saw, that maybe someday we could have a real relationship. We cried together, all 3 of us, tears for the years we had lost and the hurt we had caused and the love that had never been allowed to exist fully because it was always conditional on his remaining in the organization. I apologized for the distance I had created, for choosing an organization over my own son, for all the times I had made him feel like he was not enough simply for being himself. Martha apologized for not protecting him more, for not questioning sooner, for being complicit in a system that hurt him. David said he had forgiven us long ago, but that did not erase the pain, that forgiveness and healing were not the same thing, that we had a lot of work to do to rebuild what had been broken. He told us about Sarah, how they had stayed in touch after she was disfellowshipped, how she had been the one to help him process his own leaving, how she had built a good life for herself despite everything. He said she would probably reach out soon, but she was scared, that being disfellowshipped had broken something in her that took years to heal, that our rejection of her when she needed us most had cut deeper than anything else. He gave us her number and email and said she would decide when she was ready, but that he thought she would want to know we had left, that she had been waiting for this for longer than she probably admitted to herself. Sarah called 2 days later. Her voice was guarded when I answered, professional and distant as if she was calling a stranger rather than her father. She said David had told her we left and she wanted to verify it was true before she allowed herself to believe it. I told her it was true, that we were sorry, that we had been wrong about so many things. There was a long silence and then I heard her crying, quiet tears that she tried to suppress. She said she had to go, that this was too much, that she needed time to process. I said okay and that we loved her and would wait as long as she needed. She hung up without responding. She called again a week later and this time she talked for over an hour. She told us what it was like to be disfellowshipped, to have the announcement made and watch everyone she had known her entire life turn their backs on her in unison. She told us about walking out of the Kingdom Hall that day knowing she would never be welcome there again, about going home to an apartment she had just rented because her husband had demanded a divorce the moment she was disfellowshipped, about sitting alone in that empty apartment wondering if she had made a terrible mistake or the only honest choice she could make. She told us about the months of depression that followed, about contemplating suicide because she had lost everything and everyone and did not know how to build a life from nothing. She told us about slowly finding her way, about making friends outside the organization who did not judge her for her past, about going back to school and discovering she was intelligent and capable, about learning that the world was not the dark, evil place we had taught her it was. She told us about the therapy and the anger and the grief and eventually the acceptance that her parents had chosen an organization over her and there was nothing she could do about that. She told us about the hope she had tried not to feel every time she heard about someone leaving, wondering if maybe it would be us next, if maybe we would wake up before it was too late. But she also told us about the fear that this was temporary, that we would go back, that we would hurt her again the way we had hurt her before. She said she wanted to believe us, but she needed time, needed to see that this was real, needed to protect herself because she had worked too hard to heal to risk being broken again. I told her I understood, that we would wait as long as it took, that we were not going anywhere. Martha got on the phone too, and they both cried and talked and started the slow, painful process of rebuilding a relationship that had been destroyed by our loyalty to an organization that did not deserve it. Michael reached out a few weeks later, more cautious than his siblings, testing the waters carefully. He had been the youngest and had taken the longest to fully leave, had faded rather than making a clean break, had tried to maintain some connection with us even though it was painful and limited. He told us he had never really believed, that he had gone through the motions because it was easier than fighting, that he had felt guilty for years about not being able to make himself believe no matter how hard he tried. He said he was relieved we had left but also confused about what it meant for our relationship, whether we could be family now in a way we had not been before. We started meeting regularly, slowly getting to know each other as people rather than as roles within a religious system. David brought his family and we met our grandchildren properly for the first time, not in brief awkward encounters but in real time spent together. They were beautiful and bright and knew nothing about kingdom halls or field service or Armageddon, and that felt like a gift, like a generational curse that had been broken. Sarah came for dinner and we cooked her favorite meal from when she was young, and she cried because she remembered it, because we remembered, because we were trying even though it was hard and awkward and painful. Michael introduced us to his girlfriend, a kind woman who worked as a teacher and who he was planning to marry. He said he had been afraid to tell us before because he knew we would not approve, that she was not a witness and we would have pressured him to break up with her, would have made him choose between her and us. Now he could tell us and we could be happy for him without conditions, could look forward to the wedding without worrying about whether it would take place in a kingdom hall or whether he was doing the spiritually correct thing. Learning to live outside the organization was like learning to walk again after being paralyzed for decades, every step uncertain, every decision fraught because I had no script to follow anymore. Everything I had done for 60 years had been filtered through the lens of what the organization taught, what the elders approved, what the publications directed. Questions about what to wear or how to spend my time or who to associate with or what entertainment to consume had all been answered by the organization's rules and guidelines. Now I had to learn to think for myself, to make decisions based on my own conscience and understanding rather than deferring to religious authority. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time, this responsibility to think my own thoughts and form my own opinions and choose my own path. Simple things that others took for granted felt momentous. Saying happy birthday to someone felt like breaking a sacred law, even though I now understood there was nothing wrong with it. Accepting an invitation to a Christmas gathering made my stomach tight with anxiety about participating in a pagan holiday, even though I could see it was just people gathering to enjoy each other's company and exchange gifts. Making friends with people the organization would have called worldly felt like I was disobeying God, even though I was discovering these were often kinder and more genuine people than many I had known in the congregation. Martha and I had to rebuild our entire social world, had to figure out how to connect with people after spending 60 years in an insular community that discouraged outside friendships. At first we isolated ourselves, not knowing how to navigate normal social interactions, afraid of being judged when people learned about our past, uncertain about how to explain where we had been and why we were starting over in our 60s. We went weeks without seeing anyone except our children, spent long quiet days in our house that felt emptier now that it was not filled with Bible studies and field service partners and congregation members dropping by. But slowly we started reaching out, tentatively at first, testing whether the world was safe, whether people would accept us despite our strange past. Martha joined a painting class at the community center, something she had been interested in as a young woman but had set aside because it seemed frivolous compared to the ministry. She came home from the first class excited in a way I had not seen in years, talking about the other women in the class and the techniques she was learning and the pieces she wanted to create. She made friends there, women who knew nothing about Jehovah's Witnesses and did not care about our religious history, who accepted Martha simply as Martha, a woman learning to paint and learning to live. I started volunteering at the local library, helping with technology classes for seniors, rediscovering my love of books that I had suppressed because reading outside the organization's approved literature was discouraged. I met people with different backgrounds and beliefs and perspectives, people who challenged my thinking in good ways, who showed me that diversity of thought was enriching rather than dangerous. We attended events at the community center, joined a book club, went to neighborhood gatherings. We discovered that people were not the wicked Satan-controlled masses we had been taught they were, that many were kind and thoughtful and searching for meaning just like us. But the grief continued to come in waves even as we were building this new life, sometimes overwhelming me when I least expected it. I would be doing something ordinary like watching the news or grocery shopping and suddenly be hit with the realization of how much time I had lost, how many experiences I had denied myself and my family, how many relationships I had sacrificed for a system that now pretended I did not exist. I would see parents celebrating their children's accomplishments and think about all the events we had missed, all the birthdays and graduations and recitals we had skipped because they conflicted with meetings or because we believed such celebrations were inappropriate. I would see elderly couples who had been married as long as we had but who had built deep authentic relationships based on mutual respect and genuine intimacy, and I would realize how much of my marriage to Martha had been shaped by organizational expectations rather than true partnership. We were learning to know each other now at 60-some years old, learning what we actually thought about things rather than what we were supposed to think, learning who we were beneath the roles we had played for so long. It was beautiful and sad at the same time, this late blooming of a relationship that could have flourished decades earlier if we had been free. I grieved for the grandchildren I barely knew. For years of their lives I had missed because their parents were disfellowshipped or faded and the organization taught me to maintain distance. I grieved for the person I might have been if I had been allowed to think freely and pursue my interests and question things without fear, if I had developed my own values and beliefs instead of having them handed to me by men I never met who claimed to speak for God. I grieved for friends who were still inside, who I knew were hurting but who could not allow themselves to question, who would live and die without ever knowing there was another way. But alongside the grief came moments of unexpected joy that caught me off guard in the best possible way. The first time I watched a sunset without immediately thinking about how it proved God's creative power and instead just appreciated its beauty for its own sake, I felt something like peace. The first time I read a novel that would have been discouraged as worldly literature and found wisdom and truth and beauty in it, I felt my world expanding in ways I had not imagined possible. The first time I watched a documentary about evolution and allowed myself to really consider the evidence without dismissing it outright because it contradicted what I had been taught, I felt intellectually alive for the first time in my life. The first time I had a conversation about politics and realized I could think for myself rather than parroting the organization's neutral stance, that I could have opinions about how society should function, that I could participate in democracy instead of remaining separate from it, I felt like a citizen of the world rather than an outsider waiting for its destruction. The first time I said I don't know instead of pretending I had all the answers, instead of referring to what the organization taught, I felt honest in a way I had never been before. Small moments that added up to something like freedom, something like becoming myself for the first time at 62 years old. The months passed and we settled into our new life, strange and disorienting as it was. We were learning to live without the structure that had governed every aspect of our existence, learning to fill our time with things we actually wanted to do rather than organizational obligations. We were learning to navigate relationships based on genuine affection rather than shared religious beliefs, learning that people could disagree about fundamental things and still care for each other, learning that love did not have to be conditional on conformity. My 63rd birthday approached and I did not think much about it because I had never celebrated it, so why would this year be different? But David called me a week before, his voice cheerful in a way that caught my attention. He asked if Martha and I would come to dinner at Sarah's house that Friday evening. It was not unusual. We had been getting together more often over the past months, rebuilding our family one meal at a time, learning to be comfortable with each other again. So I said yes without thinking much about it, pleased to have another evening with our children, grateful for every moment we got together now that we no longer had the organization standing between us. That Friday we drove to Sarah's house in the city, driving through familiar streets that felt different now that we saw them with new eyes, now that we were not rushing to get to a meeting or hurrying home from service. It was a warm evening in late spring, the kind of evening where you can see summer approaching, where everything feels alive and possible. We pulled up to Sarah's house where I could see lights on inside and multiple cars parked out front, more than I had expected for a simple family dinner. When Sarah opened the door, she was smiling in a way that seemed nervous and excited at the same time. She hugged us both and said everyone was here already, as if that should mean something to me. We walked into her living room and I saw David and Susan and their kids, Michael and his girlfriend Emma, and they all had strange expressions on their faces like they were waiting for something. Then Sarah led us to the dining room, and I saw it was decorated, not elaborately but enough to signal this was not just a regular family dinner. There were streamers hanging from the ceiling in blue and silver, balloons clustered in the corners, the table set with nice dishes that did not match but had clearly been carefully chosen. And then I saw it, sitting in the center of the table on a glass cake stand, a cake with white frosting and blue lettering that said "Happy Birthday, Robert." I stopped breathing. For a moment I was back in the Kingdom Hall being taught that birthday celebrations were wrong, pagan, displeasing to God. For a moment I felt the old conditioning kick in, the automatic rejection of something I had been trained to see as evil. For a moment I wanted to run, to leave, to escape this situation that felt dangerous even though I knew intellectually it was not. Martha's hand found mine and squeezed tight, and I looked at her and saw she was crying, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. I looked around at my children and grandchildren, all of them watching me carefully, waiting to see how I would react, hoping they had not made a terrible mistake. And I realized what this was, what they were giving me. They were welcoming me into a world where it was okay to celebrate being alive, where being born was something worth marking with joy rather than ignoring as if it did not matter. They were giving me something I had never had, something I had denied them, something I had missed for 63 years. My first thought was that this was wrong, and I could feel that old programming trying to reassert itself, trying to tell me I was disobeying God, trying to make me feel guilty for participating in something I had spent my entire life avoiding. But then I thought about everything I had learned in the past 2 years, about how so much of what I believed was wrong had actually been beautiful and human and life-affirming. I thought about my children and how much courage it took for them to do this, to risk triggering my old conditioning, to offer me this gift when they had every reason to withhold it. Sarah came over and hugged me, and her voice was soft when she said, "We wanted to do this for you, Dad. We wanted you to have what you never let yourself have. We wanted to celebrate you." David was beside Martha, who was still crying, and he put his arm around her and said, "Mom, are you okay?" And she nodded and said, "These are happy tears. These are the happiest tears I have ever cried." Michael had his arm around Emma, and my grandchildren were bouncing with excitement, asking if we could sing now, if Grandpa was surprised, if we could have cake soon. They started singing, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Not because they sang particularly well, but because they sang it for me, because in that moment I was surrounded by people who loved me not because I believed the right things or followed the right rules, but simply because I existed, simply because I was their father and grandfather and I was here and I was part of their lives again. "Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday dear Robert, happy birthday to you." My grandchildren were clapping and laughing, and Martha was holding my hand so tight it almost hurt, and I was crying so hard I could barely see the candles flickering on the cake in front of me. When the song ended, Sarah told me to make a wish and blow out the candles. A wish, I thought, what would I wish for? I had spent my entire life wishing for Armageddon to come, for the new system to arrive, for all the suffering to end and paradise to begin. I had wished for my children to return to the truth, for Martha and I to remain faithful until the end, for Jehovah to find me worthy. I had wished for things that never came, had deferred joy to some future paradise that I now understood was never going to arrive, at least not in the way I had been taught. But standing there looking at those candles, surrounded by my family in this moment that was so ordinary and so extraordinary at the same time, I realized I did not want to wish for some future paradise. I wanted to wish for this, for right now, for the ability to fully embrace this moment and all the messy, beautiful, complicated moments that would come after it. I wanted to wish for healing and continued growth, for more time with the people I loved, for the courage to keep living honestly even when it was hard, for the wisdom to appreciate what I had instead of grieving what I had lost. I closed my eyes and thought about all the birthdays I had missed, all the celebrations I had avoided, all the joy I had denied myself and my family because I believed God wanted me to be separate and different and serious. I thought about my children blowing out candles over the years while I was not there to see it, growing up and becoming adults and starting families without me truly present in their lives. I thought about how much time we had wasted and how precious the time we had left was. And then I blew out the candles and everyone cheered and clapped and my grandchildren were jumping up and down asking if I made a good wish. I opened my eyes and looked at each person in that room, at David who looked so much like me but who had been brave enough to leave sooner, at Sarah who had survived being disfellowshipped and had built a beautiful life despite everything, at Michael who had quietly found his own way, at Martha who had walked this terrifying journey with me. I looked at my grandchildren who would never grow up in the fear and control we had inflicted on our children, who would be free to question and explore and become themselves. And I said something I had not planned to say, words that came from somewhere deep inside that I was only beginning to discover. I said today is the first birthday of my life. The room went completely quiet. I felt Martha's hand tighten in mine almost painfully, and when I looked at her I saw she understood exactly what I meant. I saw David's face crumple, and he put his hand over his mouth, and Sarah made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Michael was nodding, and Emma was crying even though she barely knew our story. My grandchildren looked confused, but stayed quiet, sensing this was an important moment, even if they did not understand why. I said for 63 years I believed that celebrating being born was wrong, that it was selfish and pagan and displeasing to God. I missed every single one of my birthdays, and all of yours too, and I can never get those years back. I can never give you back the childhoods you deserved, the celebrations you should have had, the joy that should have been yours without guilt or fear. I can never undo the damage that was done or erase the pain that was caused. But I can start now. I can say yes to life now. I can celebrate being here now. I can tell you that you matter not because of what you believe or what you do, but because you exist, because you are you, because being born is the most miraculous thing and it deserves to be celebrated. David came over and hugged me hard and said, "Dad, we have waited so long for this, for you to be free, for you to let yourself be happy, for you to see that life is supposed to be lived, not just endured until some future paradise." Sarah was next, and she held me and whispered, "Thank you for coming back to us. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for being brave enough to leave." Michael joined the hug, and then Martha, and we stood there in a tangle of arms and tears, and I felt something shift, some final letting go of the old life, some full embracing of the new one. We cut the cake, and it was chocolate with raspberry filling. My favorite, though I had never told anyone that because having favorites seemed selfish, seemed like I was putting too much emphasis on my own preferences. But somehow Sarah had figured it out, had remembered from years ago, had made sure this first birthday cake would be exactly what I would have wanted. We ate it, and it tasted better than anything I could remember, not because it was an exceptional cake, but because I was allowing myself to enjoy it without guilt, without the voice in my head telling me this was wrong, without holding back the joy that came from this simple act of celebrating. My grandchildren wanted to know why this was my first birthday if I was 63 years old, and there was no easy way to explain it to them, no way to make them understand the system we had been part of without burdening them with darkness they did not need to carry. So we simply said that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about what matters, and we had realized we were wrong, that we wanted to do things differently from now on. They accepted this the way children accept most things, moving on quickly to ask about presents, and whether there would be more birthdays, and whether they could have seconds on cake. We stayed late that night, talking and laughing and sharing stories. My children told me about birthdays they remembered from their childhood, the ones they attended at school friends' houses where they felt like outsiders looking in at something they were not allowed to have, where they ate cake quickly before anyone could ask them to sing because they had been taught that singing the birthday song was participating in something wrong. They told me about the shame of being different, of having to explain to other kids why they could not come to parties, of feeling like there was something wrong with them for wanting what every other child wanted. Sarah told me about her 8th birthday when she had begged us to let her have just a small celebration, just with family, she had promised, nothing big, just cake and maybe one present. She told me how I had sat her down and explained very seriously that Jehovah did not want us to celebrate birthdays, that it would displease him, that she needed to put away such worldly desires. She said she had gone to her room and cried and decided that day that if Jehovah did not want people to celebrate being alive, then maybe she did not want to serve Jehovah. She said that thought had terrified her at 8 years old, that she had pushed it down and tried to be good, but that seed of doubt had never fully gone away. David told me about his 16th birthday, which fell on a Saturday when we were all out in field service. He said he had been going door to door that morning thinking about how all his school friends were probably sleeping in or playing video games or doing normal teenager things, while he was standing on strangers' porches trying to convince them they needed to become Jehovah's Witnesses. He said he had felt such despair that day, such certainty that his life was never going to be normal, that he was trapped in a system he did not choose and could not escape. He said he had started planning his exit that day, had started counting down the years until he turned 18 and could leave. I listened and apologized and understood in a new way how much damage our beliefs had done, not just to Martha and me but to the next generation, how the consequences of our devotion had rippled outward, touching people who had never chosen this life. But I also heard their resilience, saw how they had survived and built good lives despite everything, how they had kept hoping that someday we might wake up, that the family they loved could be whole again without the organization standing between us. They told me about the conversations they had among themselves over the years, wondering if we would ever leave, debating whether they should try harder to show us what they saw or if that would just push us further away. They told me this celebration had been planned for weeks, that they had discussed whether it was too soon, whether we were really ready, whether there was a chance we might retreat back into the organization if they pushed too hard. They said they decided to risk it because life was short and they had already lost too much time, because they wanted us to know that celebration was possible, that joy was allowed, that life could be different. Sarah said she had been the one to suggest making it a birthday celebration specifically because birthdays had been such a symbol of everything that was wrong with how we raised them, such a clear example of denying basic human joy in service to organizational rules. She said she wanted to reclaim that, to transform it from something shameful to something beautiful, to give me what I had never given them. She said she knew it was risky, that it might trigger my old conditioning, but she hoped that seeing how much they wanted to celebrate me might help me understand that there was nothing wrong with marking the day someone was born. We talked about the future, about how we would celebrate all the birthdays from now on, about making up for lost time not by trying to recreate the past but by being fully present going forward. We talked about holidays too, about Christmas and how overwhelming it seemed, but also how we wanted to try it, wanted to experience what we had always avoided. Michael offered to host Thanksgiving that year, said it would be small and low-key, just family, a chance for us to practice gathering without the weight of organizational rules telling us it was wrong. Martha asked if we could start celebrating their birthdays now, if they would let us, if there was still time to be part of their lives in that way. They all said yes immediately, said nothing would make them happier. Sarah's birthday was coming up in 2 months, and she said she would plan something small, would include us, would help us learn how to participate in normal family celebrations. I realized I did not even know what day Michael's birthday was, had actively tried not to know for so many years, and when he told me I wrote it down immediately, determined to never forget again. Driving home that night I felt something I had not felt in longer than I could remember, a sense of wholeness, of being fully present in my own life, of not waiting for some future paradise but appreciating the gift of now. The streets were quiet at that late hour, street lamps casting pools of light on empty sidewalks, houses dark with sleeping families inside. I thought about all those families and how most of them probably took birthdays for granted, how they had celebrated every year without thinking about it, without questioning whether it was allowed, without feeling guilty for marking the passage of time and honoring the people they loved. Martha and I talked about the evening, about how strange and wonderful it felt to celebrate, about how we wished we could go back and do things differently with our children, but since we could not, we would focus on making the most of whatever time we had left. We talked about how God had felt present in that room in a way he never had in Kingdom Hall, how love and joy and connection felt more sacred than any religious meeting we had ever attended. We talked about the look on our children's faces when I said it was the first birthday of my life, how that one sentence seemed to communicate everything, how it acknowledged what was lost while also claiming what could still be gained. We talked about Sarah's courage in planning this, about how much it must have cost her emotionally to do something that we had taught her was wrong, to celebrate her father when her father had not celebrated her. We talked about David's face when we walked in and saw the cake, how he had looked worried and hopeful at the same time, how much he wanted this to work, how much all of them wanted us to be free. We talked about the grandchildren and how beautiful it was that they would grow up without the fear and control that had marked our children's childhoods, how we could be different grandparents than we had been parents. When we got home I went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror, really looked, and saw an old man with gray hair and lines around his eyes and 63 years of life etched into his face. I thought about the little boy who had cried when his parents threw away the Christmas decorations, who had been taught that his natural desires were wrong, who had learned to suppress his own thoughts and feelings to fit into a religious system. I thought about the young man who had married Martha and believed he was living the best possible life, who had devoted himself completely to an organization that promised paradise and delivered control. I thought about the middle-aged man who had watched his children leave and had been too afraid to question why, who had maintained his loyalty to the organization even as it destroyed his family. And I thought about the old man standing in front of the mirror now, scarred and damaged but also free, having walked through fire and come out the other side, having lost everything and discovered that what remained was enough. I thought about how this old man had finally blown out candles on a cake and made a wish and felt loved simply for existing. I thought about how it had taken 63 years, but I had finally had my first birthday, had finally said yes to celebrating life, had finally understood that joy was not selfish and love was not conditional and God was bigger and kinder and more present than any organization could contain. The months after that first birthday were not easy because growth never is, because healing is painful, because learning to live after 60 years of conditioning takes more than one evening of celebration. The grief continued to come in waves, sometimes drowning me. The loss of community remained painful. The realization of how much we had sacrificed for the organization hit us at unexpected moments. There were days when I missed the certainty of having all the answers, when I longed for the structure that had governed my life for so long, when freedom felt more terrifying than comforting. There were days when Martha cried for her lost friendships, for her sister who would not speak to her, for the community that had been her entire world. But there were also moments of grace that sustained us, moments of healing and discovery and joy. Martha's art class became a lifeline for her, a place where she was valued for her creativity and her growing skill, where she made friends who knew nothing of her past and accepted her simply as she was. She started painting in our spare bedroom that had once been used for book study, transforming that space from a place of religious obligation into a place of personal expression. Her paintings were beautiful, landscapes and abstracts and portraits, each one a declaration of selfhood, each one an act of reclaiming her own voice. I discovered I loved learning, that I had opinions about history and politics and philosophy, that I could read widely and think critically and change my mind without it threatening my entire worldview. I read books I had been discouraged from reading, watched documentaries I had been taught were propaganda, listened to podcasts that challenged my thinking in ways that felt exhilarating rather than dangerous. I discovered that uncertainty was not a sign of weakness but a sign of honesty, that admitting I did not know was more courageous than pretending I had all the answers. We celebrated more birthdays that year, each one feeling less strange, each one helping us understand that marking time and honoring people was not wrong but deeply human and necessary. Martha's 63rd birthday was quiet, just the two of us and our children, but it was the first time in 44 years that I had celebrated my wife's birth, and it felt like a small miracle. We went to David's son's 5th birthday party at a park, and I watched children playing and laughing and eating cake, and I felt grateful they would grow up without the shame and fear we had inflicted on our children. We went to Sarah's birthday dinner and gave her a gift we had chosen carefully, a book she had mentioned wanting and a painting Martha had made for her, and we sang to her and she cried and so did we. Christmas came and we were terrified, this huge holiday we had avoided our entire lives. This celebration that represented everything we had been taught was wrong. Michael offered to host a small gathering, just family, to help us ease into it. We went to his apartment on Christmas Eve and it was decorated simply with lights and a small tree and stockings hanging from the mantel. We exchanged gifts, a tradition that felt overwhelming and wonderful at the same time, and we ate dinner together and watched It's a Wonderful Life which I had never seen. When the movie was over, Martha was crying and Michael asked if she was okay and she said I wasted so much of my wonderful life. We both did, but I am grateful for what is left. I am grateful we woke up before it was too late. And I felt the same, this mixture of grief and gratitude, this acknowledgement of what was lost and what was found. We sang Christmas carols and I did not know the words but I tried anyway and no one judged me for getting them wrong. We opened presents and I felt awkward receiving gifts but also touched that my children had thought about what I might like, had chosen things specifically for me. That night driving home through streets lined with Christmas lights, I thought about all the years we had driven past these houses with contempt, had felt superior because we were not part of the commercialism and false religion, had taught our children to look away from the beauty because it represented something evil. I thought about how wrong we had been, how much we had missed, how these lights were not about worshipping false gods but about bringing brightness to dark winter nights, about gathering with loved ones, about marking the turn of the year with hope and celebration. My 64th birthday came and this time we planned it ourselves, inviting our children and grandchildren and a few new friends we had made. It was simpler than the first celebration, just a small gathering at our house with homemade food and a store-bought cake. But it felt natural now, not strange or wrong, just a pleasant way to mark another year of life. I blew out the candles and made another wish, this one for continued healing and growth, for the courage to keep moving forward, for more time to build the relationships we had neglected for so long, for the wisdom to appreciate each ordinary day as the gift it was. We were settling into our new life now, finding our rhythm, learning who we were when we were not defined by an organization. We had good days and hard days, days when freedom felt glorious and days when it felt lonely and uncertain. We had moments of pure joy watching our grandchildren grow, and moments of deep sadness thinking about friends still trapped in the organization. We had conversations about spirituality and what we believed now, discovering that we could be uncertain about many things while still feeling connected to something larger than ourselves. I started attending a small non-denominational church, not because I needed another organization to tell me what to believe, but because I wanted community and ritual and a place to explore spirituality without dogma. Martha was hesitant at first, afraid of getting trapped again, but she came with me and found that this was different. Here questions were welcomed and doubt was seen as part of faith rather than a threat to it. People were encouraged to think for themselves and come to their own understanding. We did not agree with everything we heard, but we appreciated the space to listen and consider without fear of being punished for wrong thinking. We appreciated having a community again, even a small one, even one where we did not share all the same beliefs. My relationship with God changed fundamentally during this time. For 60 years God had been the supreme authority whose favor I had to earn through obedience to the organization's rules. A God who was keeping track of my failings and would soon destroy everyone who did not measure up. Now I began to understand God as something closer to love itself. Not a tyrant demanding allegiance, but a presence inviting relationship. Not a judge waiting to condemn, but a force for healing and wholeness and life. I realized that the God I had served for so long was actually the organization's construction, a deity created to keep people in line and control their behavior, and that the God I was discovering now felt more true to what I read about in Jesus' teachings. I thought a lot about the people still inside the organization, people like Martha and I had been, sincere and devoted and convinced they had the truth. I felt no anger toward them, only sadness that they were living under the same burden we had carried, that they were sacrificing their lives and relationships for something that would never satisfy the deepest hungers of their souls. I wanted to help them see what we had seen, but I knew from experience that each person had to make their own journey, that outsiders trying to force the issue only made people dig in deeper, that the organization had inoculated people against criticism by teaching them that persecution proved they had the truth. So I simply tried to live in a way that showed freedom was possible, that life outside the organization was not the disaster we had been taught it would be. When I encountered people from the congregation in town, I smiled and nodded politely even when they looked away. When former friends crossed the street to avoid me, I felt compassion for the fear that motivated that behavior rather than anger at the rejection. When Martha's sister finally sent a brief email asking how we were, not saying anything about reconciliation but clearly testing the waters, we responded warmly and left the door open for future contact without demanding anything. My 65th birthday is coming up next month, and I already know what I want. I want to gather with my family again, with these people who loved me enough to sing to me, who waited for me to wake up, who welcomed me back without making me grovel or prove myself. I want to blow out candles and make a wish and feel grateful for another year of life. Another year of learning and growing and becoming more myself. I want to look at my grandchildren and know they are growing up free, that they will never carry the burdens we carried, that they will learn to think and question and choose for themselves. I want to hold Martha's hand and thank her for walking this journey with me, for being brave enough to question, for choosing our family over the organization. Looking back now, I can see that leaving the organization was not just about rejecting false teachings or escaping harmful policies, though it was certainly those things. It was about claiming my own life, about taking responsibility for my own thoughts and choices and relationships rather than deferring to religious authority. It was about learning to trust my own conscience and judgment, to develop my own values and beliefs, to become a person rather than a role. It was about discovering that God was bigger and more loving and more mysterious than any organization could contain, that faith was a journey rather than a destination, that uncertainty was honest and certainty was often an illusion. It was about understanding that being alive is itself a gift worth celebrating, that we do not need permission from a religious system to experience joy, that marking time and honoring relationships and gathering together are deeply human needs that should not be denied. It was about learning that love is not conditional on conformity, that family is built on presence and acceptance, that freedom is both terrifying and essential. It was about discovering at 63 years old what it means to live, really live, fully present and engaged and grateful for each ordinary extraordinary day. I think about the years we lost and I grieve them, the birthdays we never celebrated, the holidays we avoided, the friendships we never formed, the experiences we denied ourselves. I grieve for my children's childhoods, for the pressure we put on them, for the distance we created, for the fear we instilled in them. I grieve for Martha and me, for the dreams we never pursued, for the questions we never asked, for the ways we made ourselves small to fit the organization's expectations. That grief is real and valid, and I do not minimize it or try to rush past it. But I also recognize what we have gained, this hard-won freedom to think and feel and choose for ourselves, these relationships with our children that are deeper and more authentic than they ever were before, this capacity to appreciate life as it is rather than always waiting for some future paradise. We have gained honesty, the ability to admit we do not have all the answers, the willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than grasping for false certainty. We have gained compassion for others who are struggling, having walked through our own struggle and emerged on the other side. We have gained joy, real joy that comes from embracing life fully rather than holding ourselves back. I cannot get those 63 years back, cannot redo my children's childhoods or reclaim the time spent in service to an organization that did not deserve such devotion. But I can live whatever years remain with intention and presence and gratitude. I can celebrate every birthday from now on, not as rebellion against my past but as affirmation of my present, as a way of saying yes to life, yes to love, yes to the messy, beautiful reality of being human. I can be the grandfather I was never allowed to be, showing up for my grandchildren's events, celebrating their achievements, being present in their lives without trying to convert them to anything, without imposing conditions on my love. Martha and I often talk about what we would say to our younger selves if we could go back, whether we would try to warn them or whether some journeys have to be walked to be understood. We think about the courage it took to leave everything we knew, to face the shunning and isolation, to rebuild our lives from scratch in our 60s when most people are settling into retirement and familiar routines. We think about the gift our children gave us that night when they sang Happy Birthday and welcomed us into a world where celebration was not sin but sacrament, where being born was reason enough for joy, where love did not have to be earned but was given freely simply because we existed. On quiet mornings now, I sit with my Bible and read it without fear, without the need to make it say what some organization claims it says, without the interpretive framework that once constrained my understanding. I find passages that speak of freedom and grace and love, words that I had read 1,000 times before but never really heard because I was listening through the filter of organizational doctrine. I find Jesus talking about abundant life and wonder why I spent so many years believing that abundance meant waiting for a future paradise rather than embracing the gift of now. I find Paul writing about the freedom Christ gives and wonder why I spent so many years in bondage to men who claimed to speak for God but who mostly just wanted to control others. I pray differently too, not reciting formulas or seeking approval but simply opening myself to whatever this mystery is that we call God, trusting that I am loved and held regardless of my beliefs or behavior. I pray for my children and grandchildren, that they will continue to grow in freedom and joy. I pray for Martha and the life we are building together after all these years. I pray for people still trapped in high-control religious groups, that they will find the courage to question, that they will discover they are more than the roles they have been assigned. I pray with gratitude for every ordinary day, for health and home and family, for the simple gift of being alive and aware and free to appreciate it. We are learning to live in the questions rather than pretending we have all the answers, to embrace mystery rather than demanding certainty, to recognize that faith is a journey, not a destination. We are learning that it is okay to be wrong, to change our minds, to not know what comes after death or whether our theology is correct. We are learning that what matters most is how we love, how we show up for each other, how we embrace life with all its pain and beauty and complexity. We are learning that community is important but does not require conformity, that we can connect deeply with people who believe differently, that diversity of thought enriches rather than threatens. Sometimes people ask if I regret the years spent as a Jehovah's Witness, if I wish I had never been part of it, if I am angry about the time that was wasted. I tell them it is complicated, that yes, I grieve what was lost, but I also recognize that my journey is my journey, that I am who I am today in part because of where I have been. I tell them I do not spend much time on regret because I cannot change the past. I can only live well in the present and move forward with whatever wisdom I have gained. I tell them that my story is not just about leaving a religion but about learning to be fully alive, and that is a lesson that has value regardless of how it was learned. My life now at 65 is quieter than it was, less filled with meetings and ministry and the constant busyness that kept me from thinking too deeply. But it is richer, more textured, more mine. I have time to read and think and sit in my garden watching things grow. I have space for relationship, for long conversations with Martha where we process our journey and dream about the future. I have freedom to explore ideas and question everything and change course when something no longer serves me. I have my family back, my children and grandchildren woven into my daily life in ways I never allowed before when organizational loyalty stood between us. And every year on my birthday I blow out the candles and remember that first celebration, that moment of choosing life over fear, that decision to step into freedom even when freedom felt terrifying. I remember the tears and the joy and the sense of coming home to myself after a lifetime of exile. I remember my children's faces full of hope and love, remember Martha's hand in mine, remember the feeling that God was smiling not because I had finally gotten my beliefs right but because I was finally allowing myself to fully live. I remember saying this is the first birthday of my life and meaning it, claiming it, owning the tragedy of all those lost years. Today while is also not claiming just the another possibility day. Of all the years to I come. tell myself each morning, today is the only day I have, and I will not waste it waiting for paradise or earning divine approval or following someone else's rules about how to exist. Today I will love the people in front of me, will appreciate the beauty around me, will allow myself to feel whatever I feel without judgment. Today I will celebrate being alive, not necessarily with cake and candles, but with presence and gratitude and openness to whatever comes. Today I will remember that life is short and precious and should not be spent in service to systems that demand our souls, that time is a gift that should never be wasted on conditional love and manufactured guilt. Today, like every day since I celebrated that first birthday at 63 years old, I choose life. I choose my family over ideology, presence over performance, authenticity over approval. I choose to believe that God, if God exists, is more interested in love than doctrine, in compassion than compliance, in genuine relationship than religious ritual. I choose to trust that the years I have left, however many or few they may be, are enough to matter, enough to make a difference, enough to live fully and love deeply and celebrate gratefully. I choose to believe that it is never too late to wake up, never too late to change course, never too late to say yes to the life I was given and the person I was meant to be. And when my last birthday comes, whenever that may be, I hope I will blow out those final candles surrounded by people who love me, who have walked this journey with me, who have celebrated my existence not because I earned it but because I am here and I am theirs, and that is enough. I hope I will look back on these last years and feel grateful for every celebration, every ordinary day lived fully, every relationship restored and rebuilt. I hope I will know that while I cannot get back the 63 years I lost to an organization that did not deserve my devotion, I made the most of whatever years remained after I finally learned to celebrate life. Because in the end, that is what this story is about. Not just leaving a religion but learning to live, not just escaping control but embracing freedom, not just surviving but celebrating the miracle of being alive. It is about understanding that we are not here to earn God's approval through endless service and sacrifice, but to appreciate the gift of existence, to love the people around us, to find meaning and beauty and connection in this complicated, messy, wonderful world. It is about discovering at 63 that birthday candles represent not pagan tradition but the passage of time, not selfish celebration but grateful acknowledgement that we are here, we are alive, we matter. That first birthday was not really my first, of course. I was born 63 years earlier, had lived and breathed and existed all that time. But it was the first time I had permission to celebrate it, the first time I had allowed myself to acknowledge that my birth mattered, that my existence was worth marking with joy. It was the first time I had understood that life itself is the miracle, that we do not need to wait for some future paradise to experience abundance, that every day is a gift we should appreciate rather than endure. It was the first birthday of my life because it was the first time I was truly alive, truly free, truly myself. And that, finally, is worth celebrating.